Hello and welcome to Chapter 12 of Greek for the Rest of Us. Today we are going to be looking at phrases and clauses. So over the last few chapters we've been really digging into the specific words. Now we're going to start looking at how those words get put together in bigger thought units and these ideas of phrases and clauses. So one of the quotes that Mount starts out with is, "Thoughts are more generally expressed in groups of words, not just a single word." This really illustrates the danger of a purely word study approach to the Bible. If we just look at passages and think, well, what does this word mean? Okay, I found out what this word means. And then what does this word mean? Without putting those parts together, they end up being a series of disconnected thoughts. They're almost isolated from each other. And that really is not how we convey meaning in our own communication. Those words and thoughts get communicated in a packet that are sentences and phrases and clauses. So we really want to be thinking through how do all of these potentially disconnected thoughts, individual words, connect together to form meaningful units. So we'll start working through that, and later on Mounts in chapter 14 is going to introduce his concept of phrasing, which is more commonly referred to as block diagramming. And that's where we really start to put these ideas together. But we need to lay some groundwork first by talking about some English concepts. First, we have the English concepts of dependent and independent constructions or clauses. So a dependent construction is one that cannot grammatically stand on its own, which makes sense. It's dependent. Some examples that Mounts gives are after the rain stops. Okay, well, the construction after the rain stops can't stand on its own because there's something missing there. So it's dependent on something. But then the idea of an independent clause is a clause that can stand on its own. The full sentence here is like, I will dry the car. After the rain stops, comma, I will dry the car. The phrase, I will dry the car, is an independent clause. I went to the store is a independent clause. It can stand alone. Normally, this is important to note, this is normally, not always. Normally, the author's main thought is the independent clause, and the dependent clause modifies a main thought, which means a major part of our job as interpreters is to identify the author's main thought, which means it is to identify the independent clause. And then, of course, we need to then evaluate, is this truly the main idea of this sentence, of this paragraph, or not? But in general, if we can identify the independent clause, we can identify the author's main thought. So another definitional thing in English, a phrase is a group of related words that don't have a subject or finite verb. I know it's somewhat confusing because we use this term phrase rather broadly. We will use it in the technical sense, as we're talking about here, not having a subject or finite verb. But then we'll also use it in a more casual sense of like, oh, that's a funny phrase, when we're not actually specifically saying it doesn't have a subject or a finite verb. So that's a phrase, not to be confused with a clause. Clauses are like phrases, except they have a finite verb and its subject. So phrases don't have a subject and finite verb. Clauses do have a finite verb and its subject. An example of a clause would be after I went home. So there is a verb there, I went, and a subject, I, after I went home, is a clause. But it's not a standalone independent clause because of that word after. All right, and then we get into this concept of relative pronouns. Relative pronouns. A relative pronoun is a noun substitute. An example would be who, whose, that, which, what, or whatever. And a relative pronoun introduces a relative clause. So a relative pronoun introduces a relative clause. A relative clause is introduced by a relative pronoun. So we have the disciple whom Jesus loved. So here we have a relative clause, whom Jesus loved, and it's introduced by the relative pronoun whom. So it's modifying, in this case, the disciple. It's telling us something about the disciple. If you remove the relative clause, you would just have the disciple was not martyred. Okay, that's a perfectly legitimate sentence. It is an independent clause, but we have within here a relative clause that is adding further information to the main thought of the disciple was not martyred. Another important concept here is the antecedent. The antecedent is the word replaced by the pronoun. So in the case of the above example, the antecedent is the disciple, and then in the relative clause, whom is the relative pronoun that is replacing disciple. You, in this case, would be able to substitute this word for disciple, and it would make sense. Jesus loved disciple. Disciple, Jesus loved. Whom is the tense, or the case is telling us that this is in the objective case. So Jesus loved disciple, or to be more proper, the disciple would be the full antecedent there, because there's the modifying article. So you would say fully, the disciple Jesus loved, or Jesus loved the disciple. So the disciple is the antecedent. All right, and then lastly, as we're doing some English review here, function. The relative clause can function as either a noun, which would be a substantival function, or as an adjective, which would be an attributive function. So again, we're talking about the whole relative clause. So what can this whole relative clause do? And in the case of the above example, it is functioning adjectively or attributively, because it's telling us something about the disciple. But in other cases, you'll have, and we'll see some examples of a substantival use. All right, so that is a little bit of English review. Now we will go on to talking about Greek. So we just did some English review. Now let's talk about the Greek relative clauses. So we saw just briefly that the relative pronoun in English can be who, whose, that, which, what, etc. In Greek, the relative pronoun is has. And I want to just point out the rough breathing mark here. There's the rough breathing mark. So has, with an accent, in the nominative singular masculine. And I'll just say, at this point, memorization is not necessary yet. It is helpful to be able to quickly identify them, but you do not need to memorize those at this point. So, as with the article, there's a paradigm associated with has because it inflects based on gender, whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter, and it inflects based on case, and whether it's singular or plural. So that is the Greek relative pronoun paradigm. And now let's talk a little bit about relative clauses. So relative clauses are comprised of the relative pronoun, a verb, and its subject. So there are three components to a relative clause. And there's also the potential for other modifiers. Not necessary, but sometimes there's other modifiers. So here's an example of this in Mark 4:9. Kai elagen has eke ota akuein akueto. All right, so the wooden translation would be, and he said, who has ears to hear, let him hear. So if you think about this whole construction, we have, and he said, really, what he said is, let him hear. Because underneath all of this, this is a relative clause. So we have our major elements here of relative pronoun, and we have the verb, this would be the subject, the one who has ears. The having ears one, and then to hear. To hear would be your verb. So the one who has ears to hear, let him hear. So that is the relative clause example here. And then we also note that the gender and number, the relative pronoun must agree with its antecedent in number and gender. So here, we have, actually, this above example is challenging because the subject or the antecedent is an implied antecedent attached to here. So there's the subject is actually kind of buried within the acuite or acuito. So the subject is implied, but the has connects to the subject, which is singular and masculine. And we can identify that this is singular and masculine from going back to your paradigm and realizing the only place I see this is has right here. So singular and masculine is modifying the implied subject of acuito. So gender and number are based on that, but then the case of the relative pronoun is determined by its function inside the relative clause. So the case in this case, no pun intended, is nominative. But that's because has is functioning within this relative clause as the subject, the one who has ears to hear. It's functioning as the subject of this verb. So the one who has verb, and then who has, in this case, is a modifier, essentially, who has ears. And then to hear is further modifying what those ears do. So that is the relative clause, gender and number, and case. Now let's look at a different use for that. The first is the attributive use. So we talked about again, going back to our comments for English, there's the substantival and the attributive functions. So going back to the attributive use, relative clauses can be adjectival, so same as in English. Example of that would be kata, ton, chronon, han, ekribosen, para, ton, magon. And Mounts has already highlighted here for us the in italics the relative clause. So let's go ahead and put brackets around that. And then his kind of wooden translation here, according to the time which he had learned from the wise men. So here we have our relative pronoun, han. And if I go back to my paradigm, I can see where does han show up? It's right here as the accusative singular masculine. So I could just note that right now, accusative singular masculine. Now, of course, if you have software, you'd just be able to highlight over it and see that's in the accusative singular masculine. But specifically, we know that this relative pronoun is standing in the place of chronon. It's also singular and it's also masculine. So this is the antecedent. And I'm gonna box the modifier there, but technically chronon is the main antecedent. According to the time which he had learned from the wise men. So the block diagram for this, the way that, or what Mounts refers to as phrasing, would look something like this. Kata ton chronon. So according to the time, what time? I hit enter and I indent to indicate that this is a subordinate clause, a relative clause that's subordinate to the main clause, which in this case is not actually the main clause of the sentence, but the time which he had learned from the Magi, where han is the relative clause, or relative pronoun introducing that relative clause. So that would be how you would indent it with the phrasing. Now, I'm going to start, and I already have started, introducing a little bit of sentence diagramming or grammatical diagramming. You don't have to have this mastered at this point. I just want to introduce it to illustrate kind of a little bit more precision that you're able to have with grammatical analysis than you are with block diagrams. So I think this structural diagram really shows better what's going on with this relative clause. So first we have according to, this is a prepositional line right here. according to the time. Now, here we know because we're in the category of attributive that this is going to be on the attributive line underneath the thing that it's modifying. So this whole relative clause, everything that's up here, I'm going to box this in red, is showing up down here. And all of that is below this line as a modifier. Specifically, it's an adjectival modifier. It's adjectival because it's immediately below the noun that it's modifying, and this is the antecedent. The way that this is graphically represented is by having that modifier line go all the way down and then all the way over, because the way that this is represented is by putting the relative pronoun, and actually the whole relative clause, up on stilts. And then we have our relative pronoun right here. But within this clause, within the whole relative clause, this is also representing that we actually have, because we have a main subject line here, this would be the subject implied within this verb. And then we have our main line. But then Han is functioning, because this line is indicating to me direct object, Han is functioning as the direct object of the relative clause. So this is helping me see that Han is functioning basically in two different ways. One, it's functioning as a modifier because it's introducing this whole modifying clause. But then it's also functioning within the relative clause as the direct object. The what was learned, whom, or what was learned, it is the time that was learned. But the time is being substituted by the relative clause. And then this further is just a prepositional phrase that's adverbially modifying learned. So para magon ton is telling me something about how they learned, or how he learned. He learned specifically, prepositional phrase, from the Magi. So this modifying adverbially, because it's modifying a verb, it's modifying he learned. So I know this introduction to grammatical structure is probably a little bit disorienting at first. You don't need to have this mastered, but it's just helpful to illustrate and see what that looks like. All right, so that was the adjectival use. We're now going to jump over and talk about the substantival use. So just like English, relative clauses can also act as parts of speech, like a noun. So it's going to function substantively. It's going to be a thing in the sentence. So Mark 3:13, proskaletai, hus, athelen, autos. He called whom he wished himself, basically. So this is, we'll learn about this more soon, but this is the intensive use of the personal pronoun. So he called whom he wished, whom he himself wished. So right here, this whole phrase, relative clause, I should say, is functioning substantively. It's giving me what or who he called. And the way this is smoothed out in translation would be to add those. He called, who did he call? He could have called Tim, he could have called Bill, he could have called Sandy, but instead he called this substantive noun that is a full clause. He called whom he wished. And then this autos is modifying him, the wished. It's actually modifying the he, so it's the implied in there, because this already tells me the ending of this verb. I know this is third person singular, so I already know there's an implied he there. But by adding the explicit he here, which is also nominative third person singular pronoun. And it's masculine. The third person is actually, it's not a verb, it's just telling me it's a third person pronoun. By adding that additional information, it's just that intensive he himself wanted. So the way this would be illustrated, and I've included the whole verse here of Mark 3, but the part that we're looking at here is right here. So there's the implied he, which is connected to this right here. So he is functioning as the subject, called, verb, and then we have direct object line, and this is where you would expect to see something in the accusative functioning as the direct object. But because we have a relative clause, that goes up on stilts, and whose is functioning as the direct object of this whole clause. Autos does still go as the subject, but because the subject is also implied here, this becomes intensive. So it's he called those whom he desired or whom he wished and whom he himself wished. So that is Mark 3:13, kind of the middle section there that's illustrating substantival use. And then one other thing in 12.18, he talks about indefinite and how relative pronouns can be changed to indefinite relative pronouns. So instead of just who or whom, it would be whoever or whichever or whatever. So there's that indefinite ever that kind of makes it more broad. And the way this happens is by adding the word on, or also aeon. So adding that on makes it indefinite. So if you see the relative pronoun plus on, then you would want to translate it with the indefinite whoever or whatever instead of whom. So if we saw that would be he called those who he himself wanted, would be he called whoever he himself wanted, if there was the on. There is the acute there. So that would be how you would make that indefinite. All right, so now just getting into translation a little bit and how this, just one comment as we think about relative clauses. When we get to long sentences, it's sometimes that Greek sentence is going to be just too long and it has to be broken up into smaller units for the sake of English. And when that is done, because the relative pronoun is usually referring back to something that might be many verses prior, it's often helpful to just replace the pronoun with the antecedent. So you'll see the word that was referenced much previously, see that substituted in some translations. And it's important to realize that this is just an emphasis or an effort to make things more clearly understood to the reader. It's not an effort to add to Scripture. It's a necessary addition for clarity, but it's not actually adding something that's not in there. Briefly, just concluding with talking about types of sentences, there are simple sentences, which has one subject and one verb. There are compound sentences, which have two or more independent clauses connected with a coordinating conjunction or punctuation. So that would be something like an and or a semicolon in English, or in Greek, something like a kai or a dot like that. Those would both be ways that compound sentences, which again, two independent clauses, two or more independent clauses, would be connected. And then two other sentence types we'll look at are complex sentence types, which has one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. So you're going to have both independent and dependent clauses in a complex sentence. an example of a complex sentence would be, whenever I think back to Hebrew class, I start to sweat. So I start to sweat would be an independent clause. Whenever I think back to Hebrew class would be a dependent clause. And then we have a compound complex sentence, which would be two or more independent clauses and one or more dependent clauses. So it's basically compound complex sentence is just the combination of a complex sentence, which is one or more dependent clauses, and then a compound, which is two or more independent clauses. So where both of those things combined, you're going to have a compound complex sentence. All right, so going through vocabulary, I meant to do that with a highlighter. A is if. On is untranslatable, so you're not going to be able to directly translate that, but it makes a word contingent, or in the case of the relative pronoun, indefinite. So it's going to take the definite pronoun, who, whom, or which, and turn it into whoever, whichever, whatever, etc. Aeon is if. A is or, and then another sense of it is than. Te is and. Men is on the one hand. It's a correlative conjunction that pairs with men, and usually you'll see later, reading that in English, you'll see de. So usually you're going to see those together. The men, de conjunction is a correlative conjunction that usually you would translate something like on the one hand, ... whatever the phrase is or sentence is, and then de, on the other hand, ... And then we have hos is as in like he went to the store as a warrior, or like a warrior, I don't know, as the idea of like something. Tis, who, what, which, why, note the questions. And then tis without the accent, again, with the accent, question marks, without the accent, someone, something, anyone, anything. That's the idea of tis and tis. And then hos is the relative pronoun, who or whom. And we already saw the paradigm for that on the first page. So that is chapter 12, phrases and clauses. Hopefully that was helpful.